Throughout history, colonizers have used various tools to dominate and control indigenous populations. Among these, the appropriation of language, culture, and identity is one of the most insidious, as it alters how people perceive themselves and their place in the world. For the Noongar people of Western Australia, like many indigenous groups, the road to liberation and independence is paved with the reclamation of language, cultural practices, and an assertive insistence on defining their own reality. This paper explores the relationship between language, thought, and control in the colonial context, and how the Noongar people can counteract these impositions by redefining their worldview, reviving traditional practices, and rejecting colonial paradigms. Colonization does not just seize land, it seizes the mind. Colonizers impose their language, culture, and worldview to regulate thought and behavior. When the Noongar people or any colonized group adopt the colonizer's language and worldview, it reshapes their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. In this way, colonization is not merely a physical act, but a psychological and cultural one as well. The Noongar people, like many indigenous communities globally, can only regain their sovereignty and peace of mind by asserting their own definitions of reality, reviving their language, and embracing their cultural paradigm. One of the first measures taken by colonizers is the imposition of their language on the colonized people. For the Noongar people, this was no different. With British settlement came the gradual suppression of the Noongar language, an essential carrier of their cultural knowledge, worldview, and connection to the land. This suppression was not accidental, but deliberate, as colonizers understood that controlling the language would allow them to control the people. Language is more than just a means of communication. It is a way of thinking. The words we use shape how we understand and interact with the world. When the Noongar people were forced to adopt English, they were also compelled to adopt English ways of thinking. English terminology and concepts, rooted in colonialism, capitalism, and individualism, supplanted Noongar understandings of community, land stewardship, and spiritual relationships with the environment. The loss of language led to the erosion of cultural practices and the internalization of colonial values. To counteract this, the Noongar people, like other indigenous movements around the world, must focus on reviving their language. This is not just a linguistic project, but an intellectual and cultural one. Reviving the Noongar language means reviving the Noongar worldview, values, and ways of relating to the land. By insisting on their own definitions and lexicon, the Noongar people can reclaim their identity and resist the colonial mindset. Colonial domination operates through the imposition of a singular worldview. In this paradigm, Western modernity is framed as the pinnacle of human progress, and anything that deviates from it is labeled as primitive or backward. The colonizer's narrative distorts the indigenous past, present, and future. For the Noongar people, this meant that their traditional ways of life were dismissed as outdated, and their connection to the land was minimized or erased. A key strategy for resisting this imposition is to develop and embrace an indigenous paradigm. The Noongar people, like many other indigenous groups, must insist on framing their history, culture, and reality on their own terms. This involves rejecting Western notions of progress and modernity, which are often euphemisms for Western domination. By doing so, the Noongar people can reassert the legitimacy of their own ways of knowing, being, and relating to the world. An example of this can be seen in how the Noongar people view land. In Western frameworks, land is often seen as a commodity, something to be owned, sold, and exploited for profit. In contrast, the Noongar people have a deep spiritual connection to the land, viewing it as a living entity to be respected and cared for. By reclaiming their traditional relationship with the land, the Noongar people can resist the capitalist mindset that seeks to commodify their environment. This is not just an act of resistance, but a way to maintain their cultural integrity and protect the land for future generations. Deconstructing colonial lies and misinformation. Colonial societies are built on layers of deception and misinformation, perpetuated to maintain power. The colonizer's version of history is often sanitized and glorified, while the violence, exploitation, and injustice inflicted upon indigenous people are minimized or ignored. For the Noongar people, understanding this deception is crucial for breaking free from colonial thinking. One of the most pervasive lies in the colonial narrative is the idea that Western culture represents the natural progression of human development. This narrative delegitimizes all non-Western cultures and frames resistance to Western domination as backward or regressive. To counter this, the Noongar people must deconstruct these falsehoods and reclaim their own narrative. This involves a critical examination of history, not from the colonizer's perspective, but from the perspective of the Noongar people themselves. By telling their own story, one of resilience, survival, and deep connection to the land, the Noongar people can dismantle the colonial myth of Western superiority. This is not just an academic exercise, but a vital step toward reclaiming identity and sovereignty. Practical steps for reclaiming Noongar sovereignty. Language revival programs. Reviving the Noongar language is a fundamental step toward reclaiming cultural identity. Language classes, community initiatives, and intergenerational knowledge sharing can help bring the language back into everyday use. This not only strengthens cultural bonds, but also empowers the Noongar people to think and communicate in their own terms. Cultural education. Implementing cultural education programs within Noongar communities and beyond is essential for preserving traditional knowledge and passing it on to younger generations. This can include teaching traditional ecological knowledge, land management practices, and Noongar spirituality, which all serve as counterpoints to Western narratives of progress and development. Reclaiming land stewardship. The Noongar people can further resist colonial domination by reasserting their role as custodians of the land. This involves advocating for land rights, protecting sacred sites, and practicing traditional land stewardship methods that prioritize sustainability and harmony with the environment. Rejecting Western definitions of progress. The Noongar people must challenge Western notions of progress and modernity, which are often used to justify continued exploitation of indigenous lands and resources. By promoting a Noongar paradigm of sustainability, community, and spiritual connection to the land, they can offer an alternative vision for the future, one that is rooted in respect for the earth and for each other. Conclusion. Reclaiming power through language, culture, and identity. The struggle for Noongar sovereignty is not just a political one, it is a struggle for the mind and spirit. Colonization sought to erase the Noongar people's language, culture, and worldview, replacing them with the colonizers' definitions and paradigms. To regain their freedom and peace of mind, the Noongar people must reclaim their own language, their own cultural framework, and their own understanding of the world. This process involves not only reviving the Noongar language, but also rejecting the colonial mindset that seeks to dominate and distort indigenous ways of knowing. By insisting on their own definitions, their own lexicon, and their own paradigm, the Noongar people can resist the colonizers' lies and build a future rooted in their identity, culture, and sovereignty. In this way, the Noongar people can counteract the effects of colonization and pave the way for a future of true liberation, where their culture, language, and identity are not just preserved, but celebrated and empowered.